Welcome to Dark Hour Tales. Tonight's tale is The Whistler. Kirsty Crawford first heard the whistle on a Tuesday night while walking home through streets she had known for almost 10 years, and for the first few seconds there was nothing about it that seemed worth remembering. The sound came from somewhere behind her as she crossed a quiet residential junction shortly after 10:30. 4 simple notes delivered casually enough that Kirsty assumed somebody was walking home from a pub, taking a dog out late, or passing time while waiting for a taxi. She had spent the evening at a friend's house less than a mile away and had chosen to walk because the weather was dry and the route was familiar, which meant there was no reason for her to feel uncomfortable until she turned onto the next street and heard exactly the same 4 notes again. Kirsty glanced over her shoulder and noticed a man, perhaps 50 or 60 meters behind her. He looked completely ordinary from that distance, dressed in dark trousers and a plain jacket, with nothing about his posture or appearance that suggested he was paying attention to her. He continued along the pavement while Kirsty faced forward again and reminded herself that people often travelled in the same direction through a neighbourhood where most streets eventually connected. She reached the next corner, turned left towards home, and continued walking at the same pace, although she became aware that she was now listening for the whistle. It came less than a minute later, and the 4 notes were identical enough that Kirsty recognized the sequence before she consciously realized what had unsettled her. She looked back and saw the same man turning the corner she had taken, although the distance between them had reduced considerably. Kirsty crossed the road, partly because her own street was easier to reach from that side, and partly because she wanted to see whether he would follow. The man continued straight for several seconds before crossing farther behind her, which could still have been coincidence, but no longer felt like one. Kirsty increased her pace without breaking into a run, telling herself that she would be home within 5 minutes and that there was no reason to create a frightening explanation for an ordinary stranger. The footsteps behind her gradually became faster as well. She reached another junction and turned right rather than taking the more direct route home, hoping that the detour would prove the man had simply been travelling in the same general direction. For perhaps 30 seconds, she heard nothing beyond distant traffic and the soft sound of her own shoes against the pavement, and relief had just begun to replace embarrassment when the 4-note whistle came from behind her again. The man was closer. Kirsty no longer pretended she was imagining the pattern. She walked quickly towards a brighter section of road where several houses still showed lights downstairs, while behind her the man continued at a steady pace that never became an obvious run. That restraint frightened her more than if he had suddenly charged towards her, because it suggested he knew exactly how close he could come without forcing the situation into something undeniable. Kirsty took out her phone and called Owen, her 13-year-old son, who was at home waiting for her. Owen answered by asking whether she had forgotten her keys again, and Kirsty told him to make sure the front door was locked and stay inside. The sudden seriousness in her voice stopped whatever joke he had been about to make, and he asked what was wrong while Kirsty continued towards their street. She told him there was a man behind her and that she was probably overreacting, although the lie sounded weak even to her. Owen offered to come outside, but Kirsty immediately told him not to leave the house under any circumstances. She turned onto her street and looked behind her once more. The man had reached the corner and was still following, although he remained far enough away that Kirsty could not see his face clearly. She reached her gate, unlocked the front door with shaking hands, and stepped inside before turning the lock behind her. Owen came from the living room and asked what had happened, but Kirsty moved first to the window and looked through the narrow gap beside the curtain. The street was empty. Owen listened while his mother described the man and eventually suggested that she had probably frightened herself because somebody happened to be taking the same route home. He did not dismiss her in a cruel way, but at 13 he found the idea of his normally practical mother becoming frightened by a stranger on a pavement slightly amusing. Kirsty told him that she hoped he was right and tried to laugh with him, although she continued checking the street every few minutes until they went upstairs. Several quiet days followed, and the absence of anything unusual allowed Kirsty to begin wondering whether Owen's explanation had been correct. She worked as an administrator for a dental practice, followed the same routine she had followed for years, and saw nothing resembling the man whenever she travelled between work and home. By the weekend, the incident had become an uncomfortable memory rather than an active concern. The whistle returned on Sunday evening, while Kirsty and Owen were watching television. 4 notes came faintly through the front window. Kirsty stopped listening to whatever Owen was saying and turned towards the curtains. Owen noticed the change in her expression and asked whether she had heard something, but before Kirsty could answer, the same sequence came again from somewhere across the street. She moved carefully towards the window and looked outside. A man stood near a parked car opposite the house. He was far enough away that the streetlight behind him prevented Kirsty from seeing his face properly, but his build and dark jacket immediately reminded her of the person who had followed her. Owen came beside her and asked whether that was him. Kirsty told him to step away from the window while she called the police. By the time officers arrived, the man had disappeared. The 2 officers took Kirsty seriously and recorded both incidents, although they were honest about the limitations of what she could provide. She could not describe the man's face, did not know his name, and had no footage clearly identifying him. 1 officer checked the immediate streets, while the other asked whether Kirsty had any reason to believe somebody might be deliberately targeting her. She had none. After they left, Owen no longer teased her about the first night. Over the following week, the man became an intermittent presence rather than a constant one. Kirsty glimpsed somebody standing beneath a tree near the end of the street one evening, while Owen later thought he saw the same figure walking away from their road as he returned from football practice. Twice, the 4-note whistle came from somewhere outside after dark, and on both occasions the sound stopped before Kirsty reached the window. Police logged every report and increased occasional patrols through the area, but the man remained careful enough that nobody caught him doing anything illegal. The first time Kirsty understood that the situation had become much more dangerous was when Owen came home from school one afternoon nearly 20 minutes later than expected. Kirsty had been preparing dinner and was already irritated when the front door finally opened, but the anger disappeared as soon as she saw her son's face. Owen usually entered the house talking, complaining, or asking what food was available, whereas that afternoon he locked the door behind himself and stood with his school bag still on one shoulder. Kirsty asked where he had been, and Owen looked towards the front window before answering. "I heard him." Kirsty did not need to ask who he meant. Owen explained that he had been walking home along the normal route when he heard the 4-note whistle from the opposite side of the road. He initially thought he was imagining the similarity because Kirsty had spoken about it so often, but the whistle came again several streets later. When Owen finally looked properly, he saw a man walking on the other pavement and remaining roughly level with him whenever he changed pace. Kirsty asked whether the man had approached or spoken to him, but Owen said he had not. He had simply followed until Owen entered a busy convenience store near the school and waited inside for several minutes. By the time he left through the same entrance, the man had disappeared. The fact that somebody had involved her son changed Kirsty's fear into something much harder and more focused. She contacted police immediately, changed Owen's route to school, and arranged for him to travel with friends whenever possible. Officers spoke to staff at the convenience store and requested footage from nearby businesses, although the available cameras either faced the wrong direction or captured only distant figures that could not be identified with confidence. Several nights later, Kirsty woke shortly after midnight when the whistle sounded directly beneath Owen's bedroom window. There was no uncertainty about the distance this time. The 4 notes came clearly through the glass from the narrow side path beside the house, close enough that whoever made them had stepped through the front gate and walked along the wall. Kirsty went immediately to Owen's room and found him already awake. He looked frightened enough that she told him to stay away from the window while she called police. Neither of them went outside, and by the time officers arrived and searched the garden, the path and neighbouring properties, the Whistler had vanished. One officer noticed something beneath Owen's window while checking the side of the house. It was an old football. Owen stared at it from the doorway after police brought it around to the front. The ball was faded, scratched and covered in dirt, with a distinctive blue marker line around one panel that Owen had drawn himself months earlier. He told Kirsty he had lost it at a recreation ground near his school sometime during the previous winter and assumed another child had taken it. Kirsty asked whether he was absolutely certain. Owen turned the ball in his hands and showed her where he had written his initials beside the valve. It belonged to him. The police officer who had initially attended the earlier incidents became noticeably more serious after hearing when the ball disappeared. Until then, the working assumption had been that an unknown man had noticed Kirsty on the night she walked home and developed an interest afterwards. The football suggested something far worse, because somebody might have been watching Owen months before Kirsty ever heard the first whistle. The stalking had not necessarily begun on that Tuesday night. That may simply have been the night the man decided to let Kirsty know he was there. The following afternoon, Kirsty received a call from a withheld number while sitting in the kitchen. She nearly ignored it, but answered because the dental practice occasionally contacted staff through redirected lines. Nobody spoke after she said hello. Kirsty waited. She asked who was calling. The silence continued long enough for her to hear faint background noise through the connection. Then 4 quiet notes came through the phone. The whistle sounded softer than it ever had outside, almost intimate through the speaker, and Kirsty ended the call before the final note had completely faded. She contacted police and provided the call details, although the number itself had been concealed, and the call was too brief to immediately trace. Owen stopped sleeping well after that. Kirsty noticed him checking windows and asking whether the doors were locked, even when he had watched her lock them himself. She realized that keeping him in the house no longer made him feel safe because the Whistler had deliberately transformed home into part of the fear. After speaking with police and her mother, Kirsty arranged for Owen to stay temporarily with his grandmother, Margaret, who lived almost 25 miles away. Very few people knew the address, and Kirsty deliberately avoided discussing the arrangement anywhere public. Owen resisted because he did not want to leave his mother alone, but Kirsty told him that she would feel considerably safer if she knew he was somewhere else. For 2 nights, nothing happened. Kirsty's house became completely quiet. There was no whistle outside, no figure near the street, and no anonymous call. For the first time in weeks, she slept for more than a few hours without waking to check the windows. The silence gradually encouraged her to believe that separating from Owen might have disrupted the Whistler's routine. On the 3rd night, Owen called at 11:36. His voice was barely above a whisper. Kirsty sat upright in bed and asked what had happened. Owen told her that somebody was standing across from his grandmother's house. Kirsty immediately told him to wake Margaret, move away from every window, and call police from the landline while she remained connected. Owen said he could see the man between the curtains and that he had been standing near a tree for several minutes without moving. Then Kirsty heard it. 4 notes came faintly through Owen's phone. The sound travelled from the street outside Margaret's house, crossed 25 miles through the call, and reached Kirsty in her bedroom. There was no longer any possibility that the man had simply become attached to one location. He had followed Owen. Police reached Margaret Street within minutes, but the Whistler disappeared before they arrived. This time, however, a neighbour's doorbell camera captured a dark-clothed man leaving the area shortly after Owen made the call. The image did not provide a clear face, but investigators now had approximate height, build and direction of travel, along with footage from another camera several streets away, showing what appeared to be the same person entering a light-coloured van. The investigation became considerably more active after that night. Officers reviewed CCTV around both neighbourhoods, Owen's school and the recreation ground where the football disappeared. Kirsty changed locks at home, installed a doorbell camera, and had window catches checked, while police advised her to report anything unusual immediately rather than attempting to confront the man. Owen eventually returned home after investigators believed they were getting closer to identifying the vehicle from the grandmother's neighborhood. Kirsty did not particularly want him back in the house, but neither wanted to remain separated indefinitely while the stalker dictated how they lived. They followed every precaution police recommended and developed routines around checking doors without allowing those routines to consume every evening. For almost a week, nothing happened. Then Kirsty woke at 2:14 in the morning because she heard the whistle. The four notes were quiet enough that she initially assumed they had come from the street. She remained in bed and listened. Several seconds passed without another sound. Kirsty climbed carefully from beneath the covers and approached her bedroom window, keeping herself far enough from the glass that she could look outside without standing directly in view. The street appeared empty. Cars remained parked beneath the lamps, neighboring houses were dark, and nobody stood near the gate. Kirsty waited. The whistle came again. This time she understood the direction. It had not come through the window. The sound had travelled upward through the house. Somebody was downstairs. Kirsty moved away from the window without allowing herself to rush. Owen's bedroom was across the landing, perhaps 12 feet away, and reaching him meant leaving the relative safety of her own room without knowing exactly where the intruder was. She took her phone and stepped into the hallway, placing each foot carefully enough to avoid the board near the bathroom that always creaked under weight. A faint sound came from below. Something gently touched the front door frame. Kirsty paused and listened until she heard movement in the downstairs hallway, subtle enough that whoever had entered was making an effort to remain quiet. She continued across the landing and reached Owen's door, opening it only far enough to slip inside. Owen woke when Kirsty placed one hand over his mouth and whispered his name. His eyes widened immediately when she told him somebody was inside the house, but he remained silent while Kirsty locked the bedroom door and moved a heavy chest of drawers across part of it. She called the police emergency line and spoke quietly enough that she worried the operator would not understand, but the dispatcher confirmed officers were already being sent. For several minutes, nothing happened. Kirsty kept Owen behind her while both listened towards the landing. A floorboard creaked downstairs. Another followed. The sound moved through the hallway. Then the first stair groaned under somebody's weight. Owen gripped Kirsty's sleeve. The man began climbing. He did not hurry. Each step came slowly enough that Kirsty could follow his progress through the house, and the deliberate pace made it impossible to pretend he had entered for burglary rather than them. Whoever was downstairs knew they were awake, knew where Owen slept, and apparently had no concern about approaching the bedroom while police were already on their way. The footsteps reached the upper landing. For several seconds the man remained somewhere outside without moving. Then one board creaked nearer to the bedroom. Kirsty tightened her grip around the heavy lamp she had taken from Owen's desk, although she knew it would offer little protection if the door failed. Owen held the phone while the dispatcher continued speaking quietly to them, assuring them that officers were close. A shadow briefly darkened the narrow gap beneath the bedroom door. The handle moved. The chest of drawers prevented the door from opening more than a fraction. Whoever stood outside released the handle. Silence returned. Kirsty could hear Owen breathing beside her, and she placed one arm across his shoulders while keeping her eyes on the door. Then, from immediately outside the bedroom, the whistler performed the same four-note sequence Kirsty had first heard on an ordinary street weeks earlier. The sound was quiet, controlled, close enough that the door seemed to carry it into the room. Owen buried his face against Kirsty's shoulder. The handle moved again, followed by steady pressure against the door. The chest of drawers scraped slightly across the carpet, while Kirsty pushed against it with one foot and told Owen to remain behind her. The man outside increased the pressure, then stopped abruptly when distant sirens became audible through the house. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then the footsteps retreated along the landing. The Whistler descended much faster than he had climbed, and Kirsty heard something strike the downstairs hallway before a rear window or door opened. Police reached the house less than a minute later, and Kirsty refused to leave Owen's bedroom until officers called her by name from the landing. The Whistler had escaped through a small rear utility window after forcing its latch from outside. This time, he left evidence everywhere. There were muddy shoe prints across the kitchen floor, marks from a narrow tool around the damaged window frame, and partial impressions along the side path. The doorbell camera also captured a figure approaching from outside its main field of view before disappearing around the side of the property. Police treated the house as a crime scene. Kirsty and Owen stayed with relatives while investigators worked. The identification came 4 days later. A combination of doorbell footage, traffic cameras and recordings from businesses near Margaret's house allowed police to isolate a light-coloured delivery van that appeared near both neighbourhoods at relevant times. The vehicle belonged to a small convenience shop less than 2 streets from Owen's school. One employee regularly used it for stock deliveries. His name was Michael Grant. He was 46 years old. Kirsty recognized him immediately when police showed her the photograph. Michael worked behind the counter several days each week. She had bought milk from him. Owen had bought drinks and sweets there after school. Neither of them had ever thought about him after leaving the shop. The recreation ground where Owen lost his football was visible from the service lane behind the building. Investigators obtained warrants and found material inside Michael's flat connecting him to the Crawfords, including photographs taken from public places, notes recording Kirsty's working hours and Owen's school routine, and several images dating from months before Kirsty's first encounter with him at night. Nothing suggested a dramatic personal history between them because there had never been one. Michael had simply noticed them. At some point, watching became obsession. The police believed the whistle itself became part of the stalking only after the night Kirsty reacted to it while walking home. Once Michael realized that those 4 notes frightened her, he began using them deliberately because he could create fear without approaching, speaking, or even being clearly seen. Michael Grant was arrested while working behind the shop counter. He offered no elaborate explanation and never gave Kirsty the satisfaction of understanding why he had chosen them. The evidence from the home invasion, surveillance material, and repeated stalking incidents was enough to keep him in custody while the case proceeded. For the first few weeks afterwards, Kirsty and Owen continued living as though he might return. They checked windows repeatedly, avoided walking alone, and reacted whenever a vehicle slowed near the house. Gradually, however, the knowledge that Michael had been identified and arrested allowed ordinary routines to return. Several months later, Kirsty and Owen were walking through a busy shopping street on a bright Saturday afternoon. People moved around them carrying bags and coffees. Children ran between shops and traffic filled the road nearby. There was nothing about the moment that resembled the quiet streets where the stalking began. A man somewhere behind them casually whistled while walking past a shop entrance. The notes were not even exactly the same. Kirsty stopped anyway, and Owen instinctively reached for her hand before either of them had time to think about what they were doing. They looked at one another for a moment, each recognizing the same reaction without needing to discuss it, before continuing through the crowd together. Michael Grant was gone, and there was nobody following them. Even so, 4 harmless notes had become something neither Kirsty nor Owen would ever hear innocently again.